I'm going to open it up now to the participants in the room and see if you have any questions, comments for Rob, Charlotte, Bella. Please feel free to raise your hand, throw your question in the chat, put it in the question Q&A. So it's very possible, just like me, there's a lot to digest in what Bella, Charlotte, and Rob all spoke to. And they all really built off of each other. So while I let folks sort of think through what kinds of comments or questions they'd like to share with the group, and maybe get the panelists to build upon, maybe I'll throw a question out that came. I'm just checking in here. Anything coming up? Okay. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of, you all three of you talked about work. And you also all talked.
I think, Odette, you're muted.
I'm muted. Sorry. Don't know what happened there. So the host. Okay. So I was saying that all three of you spoke about, you mentioned work and the work and determination that that really addressing racism within your organization, amongst your team, in your relationship with partners. I'd just be really curious to hear a little bit more about what that actually means at an individual level. And, you know, if you're able to share a little bit about how that sort of played out, you know, with your peers within the organization, because it really is work that starts from, you know, a consciousness individually, and also an openness to challenge ourselves individually. And then it's just iterative from there. And of course, we have to look at things from an organization level, but there is something that really rests on the laurels of the individuals in the organization. So I'd be curious to hear about your sort of thoughts on that word work and what that meant for you and what that means for you in your organization right now.
I can start, I guess. Yeah, thanks, Odette. I think, I guess for me personally, like as an individual, one of the things, and not that is new, but in terms of working as an individual through an organization to do this work, is very quickly needing to separate my own identity. So very quickly talking about, not widely within a team, but I have raised it, that although I'm a person of color, but they're looking at the intersectionality of vulnerability and those that haven't had a voice, those that are marginalized. And I think, you know, Rob, you raised a good point too, in terms of Black and people of colors have different challenges and issues versus Indigenous communities that are feeling discrimination. So for me personally, is to also unpack that the intersectionality of the vulnerability, and therefore trying to relate that at the organizational level, because we've had conversations and doing the work to say, well, there is some diversity within our organization at staff and board level, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we are explicitly anti-racist. So I think that for me, my own personal journey anyways, that was an important part to identify and not, when you're doing the work, to not over represent, if I can say that, meaning that it's not monolithic, right? So, you know, just because on staff, including myself, that we're people of color, it doesn't mean that, oh, we've kind of can check that box. So that's what I would say at a personal level in terms of that commitment to that work, and is to really understand the nuance, and then to step aside and give space for those who actually don't have a voice, and how to figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Bella. Charlotte or Rob, do either of you want to comment before we go to other questions?
Sure, I can try to dive in. It's interesting, Bella, that you try to speak, you started by speaking about the need to separate your personal identity from doing this work, because that's something that I am always navigating and changing my mind about. I think that to an extent, it's really important to be cognizant of our personal identities in this work. And for me, this work is deeply personal. It's about making the organization at which I work a safer place for me to be, but moreover for other people of color to be, for other racialized people to be, for other for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be, for more diverse voices to come work at Interpares and be supported and have the structures in place that will facilitate them pushing us further. At the same time, I think many of us, myself included, and in particular, many of my white colleagues have had to grapple with how with feelings about their personal identity and feelings of guilt and privilege, and figure out how to be invested in the goals of this work and in contributing to this work in a way that doesn't let personal feelings of guilt get in the way, that doesn't allow those to take center stage in these processes. So certainly, yeah, it's a difficult balance of understanding that the personal is political, and that also we're talking about systems of power in which we are all implicated, and so also not being overly focused on individual identity or individual actions. So that's what I'll share for now.
And I might just jump in. I appreciate both responses. I did, in starting my presentation, I wanted to start with myself and recognize that I do look at the question through a particular lens and an experience. I think the question about like recognizing that as someone who's gay, it also begs questions about whether I should represent, whether it's safe to represent, whether there's something to defend or promote in that, which which very rarely has been a focus of my work. And but therefore, the approach that I would take as an individual would be a listening approach, always wanting to start by listening, asking questions of our partners and listening to their answers, and recognizing that in our humanity, we are so tremendously diverse, and that when you're talking about discrimination and oppression, working in some of the contexts that we work in, there are things that I can empathize with individually, even though the experience is so terribly different. But when it comes to discrimination, marginalization, exclusion, whether listening to women partners, whether listening to, I mean, you can choose almost any country that that I've been involved with, but let's say Ethiopia, and hearing the divisions and the tensions between the various ethnic groups in the country, who has power, who doesn't have power, which language you're speaking, who is proactively oppressed, that even it's much more complex than just a racial question, but those dynamics are still there. But the starting point to listen, even for us now in implementing the policy, when we go and talk to partners, we are bringing the conversation to them, but the place we want to start is in listening to our partners about saying, okay, we're working on this. How do you reflect on this from your standpoint, in your culture, in your society? What would this mean to you? And collect that first.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. So I'm going to read a question that we have here from Vishnu. Thank you very much. Regardless of the different approaches, the speakers all seem to have the same intent. I wonder what they feel is the biggest ally, and then what the biggest enemy is to the realization of that intent. So there's a two-tiered question here. So what would be the biggest ally and the biggest enemy or barrier?
We're just kind of going in order. I think if I understood the question correctly, I think the biggest ally, biggest, I guess, positive part of like having a shared intent is kind of piggybacking what Rob is saying, that, you know, if you're listening to each other, you're giving some, like, kind of coming from a position of like giving a bit of grace to know that, okay, like none of us are perfect in this journey. All of us are learning. It's one step forward, two steps back. But if we have that intent, then you kind of have a common space where you are allowing ourselves and others to have missteps, you know, because none of us are perfect in this journey. But on the flip side, the enemy is, as we know, doing this work, or as I think a lot of us have been talking about doing this work, just because you don't intend to be racist or discriminatory, or oppressive, you can still be. And the result of that, and the impact of that, despite all good intentions, doesn't obviously lessen the impact. So I guess that's how I read if I'm reading kind of like the good and the bad side of having good intent. That's how I'm kind of reading that question. And then the other part, which is something, you know, the people on my team and on our staff that talks a lot, and actually speaking more to looking at reconciliation, decolonization work with Indigenous partners and communities, is a lot of times you have to meet people where they're at. Or that's actually the lesson we've learned from our partners, I should say. Because figuring that piece out, just like figuring anti-oppression, anti-racism work, everyone's in a different place. So there is that balancing. Everybody has to get here, but at the same time, like, you know, working in a way that you bring people on board. And some of that does require meeting them where they're at. And then, you know, some people move faster, some people move slower, organizations including.
Thank you, Bella. Rob or Shelley, did you want to add anything?
Maybe I would. It's a really good question, and it really pushes you to think. I think maybe to start with the question about the biggest enemy, and I don't know if I would phrase it that way, but it's a huge challenge trying to implement as an organization, and whether it's this question or other questions. So right now we're doing the review, we're trying to develop processes, we're collecting information, we're putting it on the agenda with our partners. At the same time, tipping my hat to Aislinn being here, we're also very heavily involved right now in work around preventing sexual exploitation and abuse and systematizing that. And then there are other things that are on the list of what we're bringing to our partners around, whether it's results-based management or other things, systems, processes that we're involved in. And all of these questions are really important. But as a bureaucrat working within an organization, it can increase workload exponentially. And sometimes the biggest challenge is that we're running around applying the indicators, trying to measure everything without the time to go back and always remind ourselves what this is about and what are the changes that we're trying to apply and how can we do it in a way that will be manageable and sustainable. And I think that's a huge challenge.
Thanks.
This is an ambitious question. The biggest barriers and enablers of anti-racism work. I appreciate your focus, Rob, on kind of the practical. And so maybe I'll start there. As I think everyone has talked about time, capacity, budget, prioritization, these are all always challenges. And I think that we are constantly struggling to, as an organization, put our resources where our politics are, both in terms of staff time and money, and we don't always achieve that. And sometimes we don't achieve that because we are part of bigger external systems that demand that we focus our time and attention elsewhere. And sometimes we just don't achieve it. Like I said, and Odette said, we need to stay humble. I think having things like clear goals, clear strategies, clear indicators and targets, a clear shared sense of what is the purpose, what are the problems, and naming explicitly what are the problems that we're trying to change and for whose benefit, that is all an enabler of this. I think that anti-racism and anti-oppression can be large and daunting if we just think, well, we're challenging racism. That's if we don't make it more concrete for ourselves. I also think that it can be meaningless if we don't make it more concrete for ourselves. We don't want to pay lip service without doing the actual work. If I take a more, I guess, analytical approach to answering the question, of course, I have to say that the enemies are our systems of power, our white supremacy, our colonialism, our patriarchy, our capitalism, and the institutions founded upon them and that uphold them. And I think that in that case, what makes me most hopeful is ways, people, communities, movements that push for a transfer of this power. And sometimes that can be difficult, and sometimes that can be uncomfortable because it can involve real material change, ceding of power, ceding of representative positions. That's something that you brought up, Rob, ceding of material resources to groups that have systemically and for a long time being denied or whose resources have been exploited. And so, yeah, I think I'm rambling now is what I think I'm doing. Anyway, it's a big question.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left, and we do have a question that actually was the first one Susan asked, Susan James. So I just want to offer that up as a chance for perhaps Charlotte and Bella to pick up on, which is a question that refers to what you were talking about, Rob. That contrast that you were talking about, or the importance of having a distinction between the approach in working with Indigenous, around Indigenous anti-racism and other anti-racism analysis, and then see where there would be a differential in terms of action. So you talked about sort of nation to nation, Rob, which was quite clear. I was just wondering, Bella, Charlotte, and then Rob as well, if you have anything you want to add to that. Is there anything you would want to speak to around what we might want to be mindful of when we're thinking about anti-racism as it pertains to Indigenous communities and other forms of anti-racism?
Yeah,
Charlotte?
I'd love to speak to this. Thanks. That really, it piqued my interest when you said that, Rob, because something that we always say at Interpath, we address injustices at the root, and at the root, all injustices share the same root cause. And that's an integral part of our approach, is that we work on a wide diversity of issues, because again, what we're doing ultimately is resisting those power structures. And so in that ways, I think, we identify that racism, colonialism, white supremacy, these all play a role in the oppression and marginalization of Black people, of Indigenous people, of people of color, of communities in the global South, etc. At the same time, I absolutely agree that it's so important to not treat marginalized communities as a monolith, nor to treat those communities within themselves as a monolith. There is not going to be a silver bullet solution that is going to meet the needs of all communities or all people who experience racism. And I think it's essential in our work to avoid essentializing these communities and to avoid tokenizing them. If I return to my metaphor at the table, it's not enough to bring a single voice representing any of these communities to that table if that is not linked to an understanding of the diversity of these identities and of these experiences. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you both, Rob and Charlotte, for bringing that point, and Susan for asking a follow-up question. So at the Jane Goodall Institute, we are going on a journey that actually very much touch on this question. I mentioned at the outset of the presentation that this whole process is kind of coincide with a strategic plan. And so one of the drivers in terms of focusing on work, as I think some of maybe most of you know, our institute bearing the name of our founder, we are a community-centered conservation organization. So in Canada, what we're doing, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, but we're looking at focusing the work on the convergence of the three crises. So climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental inequity. And in Canada specifically, we're looking at the convergence of these three things through the lens of Indigenous perspectives. So we have made a very explicit directional decision to look at how our work can amplify and uplift the work of our partners, Indigenous partners in particular. And we're very, as I mentioned, we're still very new to this journey. So we do have a very, whereas I feel like we're trying to improve our policy to be more explicit about our anti-racism work, but in terms of being very explicit about working through the ethical space, that space in between of the societies, not one replacing the other, but equally, we actually have very explicit language and explicit intention in our strategies in our work. So we do see them, see the two things are related, but uniquely we're looking at them differently. And I like, Charlotte, to your point about not just looking at who's at the table, not just let's say one or it's not just tokenizing, absolutely. And I think, again, I'm reminded of just what our partners have been saying to us is meeting them where they're at, and sometimes leaving our table metaphorically and going to their table, chair, whatever it is that they are doing, and then just trying to ask if we can be invited to sit with them versus trying to bring them to us. So that, I think, particularly because we are, our organization has that focus on conservation and climate action, climate justice, particularly the Indigenous perspectives through steward of the land. It's also another very explicit part and different from the other anti-racism work that we're trying to tackle.
Thank you, Bella. So we're going to wrap up now, and I'm actually going to hand it over to Aislinn, but it's very clear that this session has highlighted more than ever how important it is for organizations to get speaking to each other. So in this course of the past sort of hour and a few minutes, we've gotten a sense of the diversity of the journeys that different organizations are on and have been on, the length of time, approaches, perspectives, and then at the same time, a lot of areas where there's overlap, and there's a real would be so much value in more engagement and open and very authentic sort of sharing about the different challenges and how the strategies to kind of overcome them. And then there's something for sure for me that really resonates, which is just the relentless pacing that we have to work out for ourselves. So there's finding that right pace that's going to be that, I think you said it, Rob, it's sustainable. And I mean, Charlotte, certainly the experience of Inter Pares in terms of the time that it's the work has gone on over, and also the continued work that needs to be done. There's something around pacing that is really critical. And so the checking in with each other is also really helpful to make sure that we're not feeling isolated, and we're dealing thoughtfully with that sense of urgency, that you've also talked about as well, but in a way that's going to be sustainable. Definitely the creation of the framework itself, the signing off of it, and then eventually the hub. The intent really is for there to be that opening up more of space, so that there can be collective learning, that can be a space where it's brave, so folks are speaking up, and it's also a space where people are feeling safe as well, so they're able to speak out about organizational experiences, and that will serve the individual organizations, but also us as a sector. And so there's certainly from where I'm sitting right now, sort of excitement and enthusiasm in the face of what seems quite daunting, and especially when you review the report, sort of the real reckoning with the work that we need to do, but excited about the opening up of this type of dialogue in a really honest and authentic way. And so that's it would have been fun to be able to dig into that a lot more with the three of you, and also hear from other folks that have been attending this session. But the hope is that is what the hub and the work that we're going to be able to do will be able to provide that space for that continued learning and sharing of practical resources, and really important questions that maybe keep some of us up at night from time to time. So thank you all very, very much. It's really, really very appreciated. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone who attended today. It's been very generous of you, and I look forward to future discussions. I'm going to hand it over to Aislinn, who's going to wrap us up, I think.
Thanks so much, Odette, and thanks for facilitating such a wonderful discussion. So just very briefly, I want to conclude this session by saying thank you to all our panelists, to all the signatories of the framework, and to those of you who haven't signed on yet. I invite you to learn more. All the information is on Cooperation Canada's website. I'm going to put in the chat 2 ways to find out more information. One is by emailing arc@cooperation.ca. So ARC is anti-racist cooperation. So that's how we've been calling this new hub that we're hoping to get resourced soon. And as Odette mentioned, the goal is to have spaces for dialogue, trainings, resources, and many more things. So stay tuned for more information. And if you aren't already, sign up for the Cooperation Canada newsletter. So I'm also going to put that in the chat, the link to do so. You don't have to be a member to be on the newsletter or to be a signatory of the anti-racism framework. So I encourage you to take the time to look into signing on if your organization hasn't already. It is an annual sign-on process, so the next one won't be launched until next year. And at that point, once you sign on, you commit to providing the data as signatories did this year, and we'll be looking at what progress has been made and where there could be improvements. That's all the time we have today, so I'll pass it to Anika for some final closing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aislinn. With that, I'd love to once again thank our panel, thank Cooperation Canada, thank Bella from JGI, Charlotte, Rob, Tiana, and Oh, Odette as well. Oops, I lost Odette on my screen. For hosting such an incredible event, holding this incredible space for us to learn, to collaborate, to share, to grow together. A special thank you to our interpreters, Jelena and Juliet, for providing the access to those who are participating in French as well. It's been such a pleasure to hold this space, and what an incredible start to OCIC's AGM and Symposium. So with that, once again, I thank you all for being here, for holding the space, and I wish you all a great evening and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you all.